Welcome to PACKOLUTION. In this podcast series, you'll hear the experts of the packaging industry talking about sustainability and the future of packaging. It is brought to you by Watron and hosted by one of its founders, Michaela Wachtel, and Sales Director Ton Kniepscher.
Welcome to another episode of PACKOLUTION, the disruptive podcast brought to you by Watron. Today we have Lucy van Keulen, strategical advisor at Holy Poly and founder at Latarime, as our guest, with whom we'll be talking about waste management and recycling. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
You've already had quite an extensive career in packaging, waste management, and recycling. Could you please briefly tell us something about yourself and your career path?
Yes. I had a youth in the countryside, really close to a forest, where I got a deep respect for nature. And I think that is the basis for everything that I've done so far. I like pioneering, so my first 10 years was in realizing huge solar power plants in Europe, where really the solar energy industry started. But after 10 years, the Chinese took over the industry and I wanted to look for something else. So I ended up in waste, especially household waste. The first 5 years of my waste period was in improving the metal recovery from bottom ashes. So all the household waste that we throw away, there is still a lot of valuable resources in there. But that industry was quite slow and old-fashioned, at least for me then. But waste really stuck me. So I ended up in plastic recycling, where I helped a plastic recycling plant that's now recycling the plastic waste of the 5 biggest cities in the Netherlands. I helped that from zero to a successful company. But in the end, I also felt there that being independent and advising the full plastic chain is important to really get something done. Because I'm really a connecting person, but also somebody who wants to get concrete results and not talk too long, but get action and change things concretely. So therefore, I founded my own company. That's Latarime. And therefore now I'm helping very diverse actors in the full packaging chain, from legislation to packaging companies to recycling companies, helping with knowledge and with my perseverance and kind of connector between knowledge in all several parts of the value chain.
Before I get into my next question, I wanted to go back on the topic of you're a founder of Latarime. We talked about this before, and you mentioned that this is a Japanese understanding of leaving the place you've been to more beautiful than when you found it. Could you tell us a bit about that, please?
For the Japanese, it's a kind of custom. So for them, it's a second nature that you everywhere you come, you leave it cleaner than you got it. You take with you what you brought. And it's not only waste, it's much more than that. It's also socially seen, make it a better place. And for them, that's just so natural to do that. And I think when we all would have that, that will be much better. At least it's my custom, and I want to spread that around the world. It's Atarime, but Latarime is my version of the Japanese Atarime.
Wow, it's impressive. So, and that of course ties very well into waste management and recycling. So what are the current problems stopping a working recycling chain, in your opinion?
A complex matter. There are so many factors. The basic thing what I see is a lack of knowledge. And that is not done by purpose. It is just so complex that you need to know so many details, but you need also be able to look very strategically 10 years ahead. And you need to understand customers. You need to understand legislation, technical details, what products can do.
But isn't that a job for the industry together with the authorities to make that clear to the consumer?
No, not only. Because what you now also see is the much more bigger picture that, for example, China now has realized extra number of crackers. So they are now overwhelming the European market with very cheap virgin plastics. And you see now that is really worrying me that the European recycling industry really has a very heavy period, because the demand for their recyclate, which is really improving all the time, is very low. They cannot get the money which it costs for them simply. But the Chinese overwhelm us, and all the big brands just say, okay, let's give the lowest price, because you also know now that the cost of living is increasing in all Europe. So there is bigger forces also in play. And one of this is the bigger money influence that is still leading in the world. We need to grow, brands need to grow. So the real willingness to get more sustainable of the brands lags behind. But then looking at the customer, because you say it's industry, it's legislation, but the customer is also, or can at least be, much more picky of the choices they make. They're also lazy. They don't really throw their waste away very accurately, but they also just keep buying. We should buy less and buy more.
Reusable goods, you mean?
Yeah, reusable goods, but also, do I want to have tomatoes from Spain, or do I want to use the local tomatoes? Knowing the impact, looking mainly at CO2, but also in a bigger picture of what you buy, how it's packed. Do I bring my own packaging, for example? I'm still one of the less that I see in the supermarket here closely, or when I go to the bakery, I bring my own packaging. But there's hardly nobody doing that. So also the customer need to change their behavior, but also be much more picky. I see them also being lazy and saying, okay, it's industry who need to change. No, you also have really a role in this world to make the change.
Yeah, but what I meant with my question about the authorities, that at the moment, virgin plastics are cheaper because they're not taxed versus recycled. And if that doesn't change, it will never change. The use of recyclers will not happen because it's more expensive to work with them.
If industry really was willing to become more sustainable, they would already use more recyclate. In all packaging, we can directly start with 2% recyclate in all the packaging. Then all the recyclate is also already gone because we do not have anymore. So yeah, we are money driven, but also you should understand that legislation is a compromise between several forces, but also based on issues or on knowledge of a year ago, because it just takes time. And when you know how quickly the recycling industry is changing, 1 year ago is really a very long time in recyclate. And then there is the lack of the top-notch knowledge that is needed to come to the right legislation. Legislation really can play a role, must play a role, but you should understand that it has its boundaries. So much other forces also need to change.
So from your point of view, a really big problem in this waste management, etc., is the use of recyclates. From your expertise, what steps need to be taken to create a functioning recycling chain? Those recyclates will be more used. You can be more precise about what solutions could be there.
I think indeed it starts with the regulation, but regulation needs to give the boundaries, very strict boundaries. And one of the things that's now lacking behind is the stimulation of innovation. There happens so much and there is a lot of innovation, but the legislation is stopping that. I expect a lot from innovation. That is also needed. But innovation is nothing without a brand owner who's applying it. So we need to work more close together. Companies in the plastic packaging chain who were not used to talk to each other. Hey, what's happening with my waste afterwards? Hey, should I design it in this way or in that way? Talk to your producers. What is possible? How do you see the future? So more talking chain wide. So with all the people involved in a chain, that helps so many issues nowadays.
You said more innovation has to be done. In what way do you mean? Like the design of packaging, and how should the discussion be done more often? You just mentioned that this is also a problem, that industry should be talking more to each other. How can this be done? Yeah, the first question was actually, what kind of innovation do you mean? Should there be done more?
I believe in data. Data is the new money. Data will open up so much insight and then will lead to the right decisions. But when, for example, a recycling company has got the data, hey, what comes in, what kind of material ratios do I see? When that could be related back to, hey, what comes into a grocery store, for example. And if a grocery store would say, hey, I only accept packaging of materials X and Y and nothing else. So the innovation in data and data combination would help everybody. to take the right decisions. And opening up the data, very detailed, very chain wide, so that we know data from production. What kind of materials do they use? What are the additives that they have? And the data will then show where it moves through a chain and will, for example, enable food-to-food recycling, or at least a higher grade of recycling so that it's not downcycling. So that's the innovation that I see in data. Luckily, the legislation is also forcing more and more about opening up. Another part of the innovation in data is, for example, if in each grocery store, on your receipt that you get, you have your CO2 impact per purchase. That gives the consumer direct insight, quite roughly, about what your CO2 impact is. There has been a test in Sweden, I think, or somewhere in Scandinavia, where they did this in a grocery store. The meat sales dropped more than 30% in a month's time, because showing the people what they bought and what the impact is. But innovation need also be done in technologies for the recycling chain. Waste, especially packaging waste, gets so much more complicated nowadays. You have very fine additives, glossies. It's such a big soup. Actually, it's the vegetable soup. That's what I quite often say. And we put all the vegetables together, we mix it up, and then we say to the recyclers, yeah, good luck, please make something out of it. Wow, you only recover 50%? Wow, what a bad job are you doing? But if you imagine that finding back the separate vegetables after it's mixed up, it's as difficult as that. And there again, data really could help. That's how I try to see innovation, or make that at least concrete. But what you now see is that new technologies and new data, the data speedways in the cloud are ready. But then, for example, the brands do not really know their own data, do not have them, are not really aware of them. And on the other hand, if you want to use it, then now legislation, for example, in the food recycling industry, is based on scientific proof. That is 5 years back in time where they are currently. Yeah, that cannot meet the requirements that we now have in industry to change something now. We do not have the time to wait for more than 5 years.
Tying into that, you mentioned that the food industry requires a different material, but at the moment it's not possible to use recyclates for food packaging because of food safety reasons. So they have to use virgin materials.
Yeah.
Is there a process, in your opinion or to your knowledge, which allows for plastic packaging to be recycled into food-grade packaging?
Yeah, there are some very promising results, but it's still very difficult. You have to deal with EFSA. EFSA is a critical group of scientists who care about the European food safety.
Which is quite important, I'd say.
It's very important. Yes, it's important what they do, but they base themselves on scientific proof. And that's what it makes it so difficult and also not really clear. But yes, it's important that they really do it and that we have a very strict legislation and proof on what's everything that's going into food grade.
Are these first steps, are they out of laboratory stage already, or are they just still very theoretical?
They are. But then again, need to go through the EFSA approval. And you need to know that getting such an approval takes you 2 years at least. If you now need to decide, am I going to invest? Am I going to improve in this system? Yes or no? Knowing that you have a process ahead of you of more than 2 years where the outcome is not guaranteed, makes it difficult for investors what to do.
What is the alternative?
That it's downcycled.
But you call this downcycling. I heard you mention this before, but it's not really downcycling because there's a lot of market for non-food products and doesn't need to be a packaging. It could also be a couch or a bench or a table.
Yeah, but when I look to 2050, really far ahead of us, I see that we need to keep materials as they are, in the composition as they are, with the qualities that they have. They have a certain value, and we need to keep it at that value. When you need, for example, a PET for a couch, you need another PET than for a PET bottle. So yes, you can make it out of that, but afterwards you can never crank it up again to a PET bottle.
PET is a different example because PET has a closed loop, but if you use any other material like polystyrene or polyethylene or polypropylene, they are not closed loops. And these food packaging made out of polypropylene or polyethylene or whatever cannot be reused again for food packaging. So in your wording, that's always going to be downcycling.
Yes, it's more that I am worried about materials. There will be a huge lack of materials, good materials. Mm-hmm. Raw material prices, therefore, will increase. And if you keep, for example, polypropylene food grade at that same level, then you do not throw away value. And with that value, of course, a CO2 impact, because everything that you need to add up or do again with something, it will make an impact.
Then you have EFSA again, as you mentioned before. You have to go through the authorities who listen to EFSA and say, this is not food grade.
But if I think that there will be small, closed local loops, if you keep all the PP, for example, for drinking cups, I guarantee you, if you have that in a closed loop, you can really get the EFSA approval and you will keep it food grade. Maybe later on, you can then also do that for all the PP for dairy products, because you need to know that 70%, 70, of all the PP used is for food grade applications, where dairy products is a big example of that. If we could have that in a separate flow, like we have now with PET bottles, I think that's the way to go to really come to a more circular industry and circular habits that we all need to get. If not, we will not make it to the circular economy that's really needed. And yes, putting the plastics now in a couch or in a jacket or in another application is needed in the transition towards that. I believe in those small, local, closed loops where you keep the materials at the quality that they have.
Okay, maybe let's go to the nature of the package now. Most of our packaging right now is oil-based. From your point of view, is it possible to switch all that to bio-based materials and even for food packaging?
I think that we have no choice. That in 2050, we will have 80% bio-based materials. We need to get rid of our fossil addiction. And yes, there are very good other possibilities with bio-based materials. You also need to take in mind now that you have first generation, so take the corn directly or take crops directly. But you also have this second generation bio-based materials. So that is the waste of sugarcane production, the waste of bamboo production, for example. You already now see that plastic industry is using that second generation material. You can also take old frying oils. They are adding that now already into the plastics. And I find that very promising. In the end, I think that we have much less polymers, even maybe only PP, PET, and maybe then a PE. If we now have the same chains, so the same composition molecular-wise, but the molecules are not from fossil-based materials, but from bio-based materials. And it can be first and second generation. I think that's the only way to go if we really need to go to a world where we do not go over more than 6 boundaries of the planet. But it'll really take much more time. We need to have much more innovation done, much more learnings. We need to change the habits of some oil companies, which are worldwide big influence. But I see it as the only possibility to make plastics really sustainable.
I'm just wondering, a PET bottle, I have a PET bottle here standing in front of me, and I'm just wondering, how can we make that bio-based, or are we going back to glass, or are there actually alternatives that I don't know about?
There is now, for example, PEF. That's a PET-like product, but based on seaweed. So weed is growing very fast. It's even CO2 absorbing, and they make PET out of that. And the PET is molecular-wise, the chains are kind of exactly the same like the PET that we know. So for the PET bottle, there is an alternative, but it's much more expensive for now.
Then we have the problem that the consumer has to buy it or it will not be sold anymore.
Or maybe it's our natural habit that we just reuse things much more than we have, for example, thicker packaging, but therefore it can be easily more reused. The throwaway culture that we currently have, for me, throwaway is such a strange word because I know those waste piles. I've smelled like them for months. I don't know. It is not a way. It's still on the earth. It's a very delicate equilibrium that's there in nature. And it is not thrown away. We should teach and educate our kids now already, because I think our generation is lost. And even 20, 30-year-old generation is also a kind of lost already. But we should educate the current children that that's the habit. They will say, Mom, did you really eat meat 50 years from now? I really think that has to happen to get where we need to go to. And that bio-based is one of the things that we need, and also much more basics in polymer types that we now can say. And there are already really a lot of alternatives bio-based.
And going back to the bio-based materials, how about the recycling of these bio-based materials? Is this different from fossil-based plastics?
Yeah, very good question. Actually, last week I still had a big discussion with the university about this. They're doing a lot of research on bio-based. Also with a big plastic producer, I had a discussion about it. When they are alike, and when it could be that if you have a PP from oil or a PP from algae, for example, when the chains are alike, then it would be possible that you have exactly the same installed technologies, recycling them. That's the way I can understand it, that it could happen. And the other way is that when it are algae, that, for example, it easily can be biodegradable or biodegraded. But there I see the hiccup that the consumer needs to know that then the consumer needs to have clear, okay, this I can throw in nature or in my green garbage bag, and that should be in the gray bag or in the plastic recycling bin. I see that we need a big transition there, but I don't know yet how that will look.
From what I've heard, current bio-based materials, once you turn them into a polymer, they have to be treated as a polymer in recycling. So that means if you use sugarcane waste or beet pulp waste and you turn it into a polymer, which is great because it's not fossil-based, but once you start recycling it, you should recycle it just exactly as you recycle fossil-based plastics.
Yeah, and there I see also the possibility of a transition, that it moves from 1% bio-based to 5 to 10, and then you can have a slight transition towards bio-based. If we need to set up a full new recycling technology and installed base, then we will not manage it within 50 years.
But at the moment, there is no advantage for the recycling to use bio-based other than it doesn't come from the same source as the former oil-based or fossil-based plastics come.
Yeah, so therefore you need legislation and you need a deep understanding, and there the big plastic producers come into play. They have so much chemical expertise that they're way ahead of everybody. They have so much investment power. I really hope that they help us with their knowledge, with their chemical knowledge and understanding in how this transition can take place.
Yeah.
But may have a separate recycling for only bio-based packaging, so to say, I don't see that possible. That will take too much money, too much time, will go too slow.
Yeah, but I think I agree with you when you mentioned that we need to educate the consumer as well, because in this case, most consumers confuse bio-based with biodegradable, so that they think if they buy something which is made out of bio-based plastics, they can leave it in nature, which is not correct.
They can leave it in nature. It's a little bit less harmful with all kind of microplastics. But indeed, the communication and education should not be underestimated, what we still need to do there. And therefore, the impact of the customer behavior, knowing how that will develop and that we have to change that and change it significantly. I read an article about that we can read our brains, but also therefore by just having electrodes on our heads and then read what you are thinking. And you often think other things than that you say. And that's especially the difficulty with customer behavior. We give the socially accepted or preferred answer, but we act then differently. But when we can read our brains, we can also influence them. One of the innovations. Maybe we will have in 2050, we have a glass on, maybe, where when you look at, for example, I want to buy spaghetti, what's the impact CO2-wise of that one? What's the CO2 impact of that one? Hey, for this week, I only have 2 grams of CO2 left, so I need to buy that one. Your glasses is all telling you that. And also maybe then it's influencing your brain as well, that you say, oh, no, I want it with fried, I don't know what. But then something can say to your brain, no, take the vegetables, that's much more healthy. And then you get influenced by the same glasses, analyzing all the data that's around you.
I'm not sure yet that's going to be within the next decade.
It's very visionary, but I think that in the end, the customer is, sorry to say, quite dumb, is quite dirty, is quite lazy. But that need to change. And I don't know if that will change also in a decade. So then we need to force it more to get the change. Because just leaving it free and only communicate and ask will not be enough.
Forcing is a good word for the next question, because what should legislation do to positively impact the process of creating functioning recycling change?
Giving strict boundaries and stimulate innovation, but I also see a big push for opening up data in the full chain and be very precise which data need to be given, to which depth, to which detail you need to open up the data and give it to the next player or the other players in the game to know and to make, for example, mass balances or make them able to make mass balances. So the legislation is setting the game, but not determining in detail the game. I think they cannot manage that. One of the other things is maybe a bit strange, but we've seen in Corona that really legislation and things can change so quickly. I almost foresee a big scandal of the impact, for example, of microplastics or other things. And then within a year, legislation really can change and become much more strictly than it was. So also a kind of scandal would enable legislation, forcing a speed that we haven't seen before.
Under the title, How Do We Pack in 2030, you already shared a lot of information and your visions with your readers. Can you please give our listeners an outline of the content and what does packaging of the future look like in your opinion?
Yeah, packaging in 2030, especially 2050, really will look differently. And that all will start with looking at things that change in the world. China will become more and more leading in the world. But China is not such a democracy as we have. So they act differently, and also the consumers there will act differently. Besides that, there will become a big lack of materials. So raw materials or materials will get much more expensive. That will lead to smaller, closer, closed loops, to my opinion. So, for example, IKEA will be willing to take all their IKEA products back. But also the Heinz tomato ketchup will say, hey, give me all your Heinz tomato ketchups back. Frying pan producer will say, hey, give me all my frying pans back. So closed loops of certain materials with a certain quality. That's where it will be heading to. Another big part is there that biobased will play a big role in the full change that we have. We talked already about that, where it's not only the first generation, but also the second generation. And the influencing customer behavior also will be a big thing that comes up into packaging.
Do you see a role for intelligent packaging there?
I don't know if it needs to communicate because that is quite expensive in relation to the packaging. Packaging is a very lightweight, cheap thing, and that's an advantage. You can reach, I think, almost the same with data. So if you know what got in a certain chain, then it also needs to get out for a certain extent. There needs to be a kind of code so that consumers can scan it or can get the knowledge, hey, how should I throw this away? Where is it made of? What can I do with this? To give knowledge to the consumer. It will be much more on mass balance. On packaging level, I think that is too difficult. But on reuse, you now see that you need to have a kind of deposit to get it, because else it's too easy for a client to throw it away or do something else with it. You wouldn't get forced. But I believe in deposit systems that are kind of with gamification. so that you kind of get a link in your mobile phone. Hey, you didn't bring it in yet. When you don't do it within 5 days, we will charge you X or Y. So make it a kind of in a funny way, or that you can say, hey, your family brought in so many bottles, but you didn't for this month or something. So make it gamification wise, everybody linked to your cell phone based on a kind of data, but more mass balance data than on each packaging. Because you have a kind of 7 pieces of packaging per person every day. That would be so much that I think that that's a little bit too complicated.
So we have reached the end of this episode. Is there anything that you would like to add, Lucy?
One thing that I didn't really touch is the tipping point where I believe in. We now have a kind of critical mass of consumers of around 7-8%. The percentages differ a little bit, but that's my feeling. There's no proof for that, but that's my feeling that I have. It is sad that when we have a 20% mass of critical consumers, we can change the market, and brands really have to listen to the critical consumers. 20% is not that much, to my opinion. And I think with things happening that you see, a new generation coming up, Generation Z, is really different than how we are doing, and they will spend more money out of home. They will spend their money differently. So the tipping point that will come up, I see that as one of the lights for the future, so that the consumer will really start changing from bottom up, and not that legislation from top down will change it. And then with more stringent legislation, with that critical consumer, with bio-based innovation, and with a lot of data, I think we can reach what we need to reach for 2050.
So that concludes another episode of our podcast, PACKOLUTION. Thank you, Lucy, for sharing your experiences and vision with us. Very interesting for us and hopefully also for our listeners. Please stay tuned in this channel for more inspiring episodes of PACKOLUTION with experts in the packaging industry.